We good? All right, thank you. So tonight we're going to be talking about the collapse of medieval Christianity. A lot of people look and say, well, this is the Dark Ages. This is part of the reason why is because of all the stuff that happens and then the collapse of the church in general. Ultimately, by the end of this, you'll hear about how they've elected two different popes and how they try to figure out how to do things against each other, and it gets all crazy. So when we leave the middle of the 1200s, we have a golden age. And then in around 1260, things start just falling apart. In 1261, in particular, Latin Empire of Constantinople comes to an end. The rise of nationalism, war, corruption, plague, invasions, and nepotism all bring an end to medieval Christianity in a really sad way. When the economy is changing from the barter system to the money system, we see a change. We find feudal lords competing for power with the new rising class. We see the new rich versus the old rich. The landowners, who are the old rich, versus all these people in a almost capitalistic way, making money and making more money, and so there needs to be some kind of balance. So the old wealth then begin to tax people who enter their land. You're coming into my property, I'm going to tax you for entering into my property. Have you ever seen a toll tax? This was happening a lot because you step on my land, you have the new money, I want it, and they continue to tax them. We also see centralized government begins to help the new wealthy class because the government wants those lands of the old wealth. So we have conflict. Economic conflict, which is starting to happen. The centralized government then starts protecting trade, begins to regulate the coinage, and it slows thieves, and it brings the small-scale wars that would happen between different nobles to an end. And so it's kind of, in a way, a good thing that it's happening, and yet there's conflict because you have a rise of new powerful people versus the old powerful people. Kings used to benefit because this new wealth became on his side. Bankers, merchants, growing wealth helped to centralize the governments. In a way, it established a monarchy. In these different states, we see England and France really come to power during this time because they are looking at their king as the main focal point of the government. We also see this in some of the Scandinavian states, which are ruled by powerful monarchs. However, Spain, Italy, parts of Germany, they had these feudal lords, which they were kind of like city lords, where they had this property and they were ruling those state, that group, that area, which we would look at as a state, but they were just ruling that area. And you have this in Ireland, you have this other places, and so these people are not united as much as now France is united by one solid person, a monarch, England, a monarch, and then the Scandinavian countries, monarch. Nationalism gives rise as people would speak as a French nation and not just a city where they're from. At this time, people would say, I am from Ithaca, I'm an Ithacanian, for an example. But in reality, you would say, I'm a Michigander. And because their states are about the size of or their countries are about the size of our states. And so because of this, you would say, I'm from. And so that gave rise to nationalism. French people started saying, well, we're French. We're different than the English. We're French. We're different than the Italians. We're French. We're different than the Spaniards. We're French. And that gave rise to this understanding of nationalism, a pushback against papal power because now you're no longer just Catholic, you're French Catholic. You're different. We see this with the French having opposing popes elected. If the current pope does not go with France's wishes, then that pope is somehow robbed of his authority. And we see this a lot at the end of this presentation. You're going to see this a lot. If you're not a French pope, or if you're not for France, you're against France, and we're going to elect a new pope because you're not for us. You're against us. We also see war break out. Something called the 100 Years' War is kind of a consistent war between England and France, with other parties joining in, often Scotland, often some of the Scandinavian countries, sometimes other countries. And it started because Edward III of England, he was the rightful king of both England and France. But his cousin, Philip the sixth, said, no, I'm the true king of France. Can you imagine telling your cousin, dude, get off the throne, that's mine? That's what's happening. When England wanted to invade Scotland, Philip supported the king of Scotland named King David. War breaks out between Scotland and England. Emperor Louis of Moravia then gets involved. Some kings of Spain get involved. Other small kingdoms in Europe then join in. And in a way, this is probably our first European World War back in the 1300s. Just horrible. Lots of death. But it's all because of nationalism. It's all because of the people who are saying that I have power, I want what you have. And because of this, soon England goes and they start defeating France. They cross the channel and they take over some of those northernmost cities, and then they run out of money. Because back then you really couldn't just print money and keep on going to war. You had to use the money that you had. So England runs out of money. In a way, this kind of ends the beginning of the English and French 100 Years' War. But then people in Spain start having conflict. Well, when they're having conflict and you have a little bit more money back in your war chest, you go back to war with France. And so they pick different sides of what was going on in Spain, and they begin to fight. The new king of France, King Charles VII, who is crazy, ends up causing a civil war in France. What does England do? They figure out which side they want to be on, and then they choose to fight on the side of the French that's against the other French, so that they're killing French people. And so this drama continues to go and happen. England invades, England loses money, England then retreats, then comes back when they have money. But during the Civil War, we find a big name figure that we want to look at for just a moment. Have you ever heard the name of Joan of Arc? This is the time when she comes. France is in civil war. England is helping out, while Joan of Arc, dressed in French metal armor, goes into certain cities, and then she comes back out, and then she keeps on going back in, and what she's doing is she's helping people get out of the English-controlled areas. She ends up taking the side of Charles the Sixth, his son, Dauphin, and is able to convince the English troops to pray on Sunday. Kind of a weird thing, you'd think, right? But the reason that she had them convinced you have to pray on Sunday is because she was letting the French retreat. And she was helping the French to get to a place that they would not be attacked if England was to pursue them. Because of this, Dauphin then gives his support to Joan of Arc. He ends up changing his name to Charles the Seventh, which is the name of the guy that was crazy, so it kind of can get confusing. And because of this, he becomes king of France, and Joan of Arc was there at the crowning at the altar praying. Joan was then captured by the English, ransomed by the Bishop of Bourrivis, and then he wishes to try her as a heretic. So if you ever know the story of Joan of Arc, she ends up dying because she's a heretic, according to this bishop, and she ends up being burned at the stake. But that's not the full story. She ends up being looked at as a heretic because she says she receives orders from God to be on the French side and to help the French out. And then she also is dressing like a man. And according to back then, you don't dress like a man, you dress like a woman. You shouldn't be in armor, you should be in a dress or some kind of clothing. And so this is different than the original charge of heresy, just from hearing from God and doing what God's called you to do. But they also said that she was a witch. We kind of see with Salem witch trials how that kind of happened too. The trial took place in Rouen, and she first said, I never heard from God. I'm sorry for dressing like a woman. I'll never do it again. But then she hears a word from God through one of the saints that she should then ask for forgiveness from the saints for what she said in a lie and asking for being forgiven. And so she takes that thing that she said, saying, I don't hear from God. I'll never dress like a man again. And she says, I'm gonna hear from God all the time. I don't know what you guys are gonna do, but I'm not gonna not hear from God. And so a short time after she rescinds her recantation, she says, St. Catherine and St. Margaret tell her that she needs to withdraw that confession. Joan of Arc then was taken to the Old Market Square, and she was burned alive. And then 20 years later, Charles VII, the not mad one, comes to Rouen, where she was condemned, and he says, you're forgiven, you're exonerated, which was kind of too late, but he exonerated her in France. But at this time, then, this makes not only France an ally of the Pope, but if you're at war with France, you are at war with the Pope. So England, certain parts of Spain, other parts in Scandinavia, you hear of excommunication all the time, all over. One thing that was kind of crazy about not Joan of Arc, but another person, I'm going to get to that, but a lot of people are practicing this thing called mysticism. It's the belief where you're in a trance or you're in some kind of prayer, and you have a vision, and the vision is kind of like crazy and wild, and something happens in it, and you believe the vision more than you believe the scripture. And so mysticism is what's been happening during this time. Just a little theological thing that was happening. But you have people like Joan of Arc, you have people like Catherine, who we'll be talking about, of Siena. You'll have people like Teresa of Avila. You'll have people in this time period who will have these visions and these dreams, and they believe they're from God, and they don't match up with the Bible, and so they're going to be starting to call heretics. We'll see this with the Spanish Inquisition. We'll see this with other things, but specifically mysticism is starting to really get a hold in the community of Christians. As we continue throughout this lesson, in 1347, two huge things happen. The first thing is something called the Great Plague of 1347. The second is what we would call the Little Ice Age. If you ever heard of that, it's called the Little Ice Age because something happened with the temperature. The temperature kind of fluctuated in such a way that made all the crops, there was famine, there was horrible things that were happening with food supply. Many people died of diseases at this time because they just were not getting fed any kind of nutritious things. The Great Plague, transmitted by fleas on the back of most likely black rats, animals, continue to spread. And so what we see here on this map is the beginning of the plague, beginning over here near the Black Sea, and then through different places and ports it continues to spread, goes every which way in all these ports. But then we also see it crossing land and then going to ports. So the Black Plague ends up going everywhere. It's not just in that part of what is modern day near the Black Sea, but it's going west, and many people are getting sick. It gets so bad that when people catch the plague, they end up having fever, dizziness, loss of memory, swollen lymph nodes, and then usually death. And it was a quick death within 5 days of getting your first symptom of fever. So people died. And it wasn't just what we experienced with COVID. It was extremely bad. 1 out of every 3 people died in Europe. It was massive death. The plague came back about every 10 to 20 years based on the young kids not having immunity to the plague that had happened to all the adults. So many kids would die young because of the plague. And one of the things that happened during the plague that kind of pushed back against the golden age of medieval Christianity, as you remember, we talked last week about how reason was starting to come and make a huge thing. Well, make sense of your child dying from the plague. And that's the hardest thing to do. Reasonably, we can't figure it out. And so what ended up happening is they pushed against reason at this time, and they actually went towards more superstition. They started thinking, well, my child died because I did something wrong. Well, my child died because of something that somebody else did. And so you got to try to figure out who you want to blame because something happened and you can't figure it out. So you want to use some kind of superstition or magic to say that something happened, a witch cursed my child, or things like that. So there was a lot of that back then. Because of this, trade began to slow. People were realizing that the merchants that were carrying these diseases were being killed, and they died. And so people were losing their jobs because their bosses died. We see a lot of people have a new high emotion of fear. That must be the theme today, because we talked about that earlier today. But there was this fear, and it wasn't just about the plague. They began to fear even more so in hell. They started thinking more about hell. They started thinking, is God judging us for something that we don't know about? Is there something that we're doing that God is judging us as a nation? Is God judging us as this group of people? And so they started pointing fingers. And of course, as you know, fear motivates people, unfortunately, to do many bad things. And one of those bad things was the beginning of the Jewish persecution in the 1300s. What was happening is Christians were superstitious. They did not have cats because cats were associated with witchcraft. If you have a cat today, I don't think of anything less of you, right? But it's just one of those things, right, that cats have an association with witchcraft, especially back then in the superstitious age. So what ends up happening is the Jewish people are not as superstitious. They have cats. Cats are killing the rats. Because cats kill rats, you get less fleas that are biting people that have the Black Death on it. And so what ends up happening? The Jewish people have less. So therefore, there's a conspiracy. The Jewish people are poisoning our water, and they're killing our people. And because of that, we hate the Jewish people. So mass persecution and mass destruction of Jewish lives happened at this time because they were blaming these people. And it wasn't like a horrible like genocide that was happening, but it was pretty serious. It wasn't the Holocaust, but it was pretty serious. A group of people were not harmed by the plague, so they end up getting harmed by the people who were harmed by the plague. What's interesting about all that is that even on the Eastern Front, there's destruction. We talked about the Latin church leaving Constantinople. But one person by the name of Sultan Muhammad II wanted Constantinople, and he wanted it extremely bad. He wanted it so bad that he was willing to destroy it in order to take it. So at the Council of Ferrara, Florence in 1439, in the West and the East, they began to try to reconcile. They try to figure out, how do we bring together the Western Church, the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church? How do we bring this together? Well, the Pope at the time said, we can help you out. Let's shake hands. Let's reconcile the two factions from what happened in 1054. Unfortunately, as the Pope's trying to get people from the West, the kingdoms that constantly were fighting each other, to go fight somebody else, nobody came to help the East. In 1443, then, because nobody came to help the West, from the West, patriarchs in Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch then breaks with Constantinople because they say, why are you trying to join the Catholics again? And then in Russia, they broke away too. So now you have a Russian Orthodox Church, you have what's left of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then you have more of kind of like a Coptic church, which is Jerusalem and the Antioch and Alexandria. Ultimately, roughly 1 year later, or no, 10 years later, specifically May 29th, 1453, Constantinople ends up falling through siege to the Turk invasion, and soon after is renamed Istanbul. So if you were always wondering what is Constantinople, it is the city of Istanbul. There's a song about that, Putting on the Ritz. Remember that? So because of this, sorry, I'm moving pretty fast. You okay with this? Okay, because there's drama about to happen. So corruption is also part of the collapse. And here's where the corruption starts happening. Money becomes huge as an issue in the church. Pope Boniface the Eighth was fluent in politics. Just like Leo before him, he knew his politics, he knew how to be political, he knew how to be fluent in the diplomacy, he knew how to woo kings and make the kings do what he wanted them to do. Boniface is believed to have sought reformation in the Catholic Church through power. He pushed what he had, he threw his weight around, if you will, to show people that he knew what he was doing. A person by the name of Celestine V was still Pope, but Boniface was elected Pope. And so you have two popes. Something that the Pope cannot do is to be Pope when somebody else is Pope. That's one of their laws, their canon laws. And yet we have two popes. Boniface ends up calling for a crusade against Celestine and all the other people who are wanting him not to be Pope. A group of people known as the Colonna, a powerful family in Italy, they end up getting their lands taken because the Pope's like, you're trying to tell me that I'm not Pope, and you have land, and I'm going to confiscate that. So many of them move to France and try to seek protection. Then Boniface gets involved with Germany. He ends up getting involved in conflicts with England, and then France, and then even Scotland. He is getting his hands into every single political power of the time because he's got that kind of reach, right? He's, again, moving his weight politically. Through this, about 1300, Boniface then claims a year of Jubilee and says that anyone who goes to the tomb of St. Peter will receive indulgences, meaning that they would be spared time in purgatory. The belief in purgatory is that you have to spend time in purgatory and you need to be absolved and your sins are kind of erased at certain points as you do penitence in purgatory, and then you get to move past purgatory to actually go to heaven. This is not a Protestant belief. There's reason for the Protestant Reformation because of this. But these indulgences, you earn them. You're earning your way through purgatory as you get these indulgences. And you do it because you're going to the tomb of St. Peter, which is in St. Peter's Basilica, which is the Vatican. So these people are flocking. They're spending lots of money. They're doing all these things here to... Are you taking notes? Oh, okay. So as he's doing this, indulgences, purgatory, those kinds of things are happening, and we see this as more corruption starts happening in the church. And again, next week we'll hear more about what that stuff was doing with the beginning of the Reformation. One success after another, Boniface had to call for the torture. 16, 17. Where's 18? Okay. My printer was not printing the right way. I did not email it. I appreciate that, though. So now I have to remember what I wrote down. All right. All right, so Boniface, there's a lot of corruption. As we're going through, we learn about these people and then those people. So what ends up happening is through a lot of different popes and a lot of different things, the corruption continues to happen, and so much so that they start looking at who are our rivals. One of those rivals were the Knights Templar. That group of people, known as the Knights Templar, were monastic, but they were also warrior knights, and so they would be monastic and knights, and they would do those kinds of things. Well, they were gaining so much wealth and so much power through the banking and getting so much money, they started becoming a threat. And because of this, the Knights Templar ends up getting persecuted. Different things that were said about them: oh, they're sodomites, they're greedy, they're spitting on the cross, they're cursing Christ. So basically all these rumors that the Knights Templar was doing these things that were pagan or that were worshiping idols. So what ends up happening is Philip sees their weaknesses. Philip is the king of France, and he goes after them, and he starts attacking them even more so because they were powerful. And as they start confessing because of torture, they weren't confessing because it was true, they were confessing because of torture, more people started believing these Knights Templar are actually doing what the people are saying that they're doing. It ended up coming to a point where one of their leaders, Jacques de Molay, ends up being tortured, and then he confesses that all this stuff was happening. The Pope then says, we're going to start confiscating their lands because the Knights Templar had a lot of wealth. We're also going to start taking their money, and then we're going to make them stand trial. So they stand trial, and what ends up happening? Jacques de Molay and a few others are in Notre Dame's cathedral in France, and they say, we said this because of torture. We think that was wrong, and we are recanting our confession. Those rumors that they're saying about us are all lies. And then on the spot, they take them, and then they go burn them alive. There was a lot of that happening back then. So we see this conflict that begins to happen. The Pope is saying one thing, the King Philip is saying another thing, and so we start seeing this conflict between the Pope and the King of France. So much so that Philip says, Pope, these Knights Templar are your people. You need to pay for the trial, and I'm going to confiscate their lands myself. You want to confiscate them? I'm going to confiscate them. And when you pay me my money for the trials, I might think about giving those back to you. There was a lot of political power play and corruption and teasing and different things happening in France. So what then happens as these people are being burned and this corruption is happening? We have something called the first Babylonian captivity of the church. Clement, the Pope at the time, dies in 314, but he sets the papacy up for being French for the next 100 years, if not longer. Something called the Babylonian captivity of the church, or the Avignon, can't say it right, I'm not French. Avignon? Okay, that's good. So maybe it doesn't make sense. Mark's always telling me, you got to make sure you get the right pronunciation. So, for the next 70 years in France, in this place called Avignon, there is a pope living in France, not in Rome. The Bishop of Rome is living in France. There will be a lot of interplay at this time between the Pope and the King of France. There's a heightened activity of upsetness because the Pope is in France, and everything the Pope is pushing for policy is French policy. If you're British, if you're part of the England, if you're part of Spain, if you're part of Germany, if you're part of Scandinavia, and you disagree with the Pope, you're also at the time disagreeing with France. They had a really interesting wedded matrimony between the Pope and the papacy and the French. No one's living in Rome. The policies of the Pope are also French policies. The next Pope elected when he was 72, they thought he was going to die very soon because he's 72. Popes don't really live that long. But this Pope ends up living quite long. John the 22nd was Pope from 1316 to 1334. That's a pretty decently long papacy if you think about the person being 72 when they started. The thing that Pope did was he began to help the French impose wars on Italy. Italy was where the Pope used to be. Now he's in France. There were power players in Italy that he was trying to get away from. So they start making war on Italy. We see church taxes begin. We see pro-French policies continue to push against Italy. The next Pope, Benedict the 12th, served as the next Pope from 1334 to 1342, much smaller time. But he lived in Avignon and moved the papal archives to France. So many people know when you go to the Vatican, they have this museum, they have a lot of the archives. They're all in the basement or something like that of the Vatican. Well, that Pope at the time moved everything from Italy to France. Again, it's a power move. Look, we have all the stuff, you don't anymore. In this, we see both England and the Holy Roman Empire begin to dislike the French Pope even more, which is part of the 100 Years' War. We see under Clement the Sixth from 1342 to 1352, the papacy was about pomp and wealth. This is where the Pope looks like he's wealthy. He's got the gold chains on. Today we call it bling bling. Back in the day, it was just, showing his luxury. Look at all the wealth that the Pope has. He's got gold. He's got other things. Look at all this stuff that's inside the Pope's mansion. It's all gold. This is very different than the Franciscan Pope, where they didn't want to have any wealth. They didn't want to have anything. They had a vow of poverty. So we see this completely distinctive thing. The Franciscan popes, poverty. These popes that were very corrupt and had power, they wanted to show off their wealth. And they showed it off through their diplomacy. They showed it off through what they knew. They just kept on showing it off and saying, look who I am. I'm the Pope. I have power and you don't. And that was important at that time. And then we see the Pope's not in Rome. We see a time of plague. And many people look at what Clement VI and all his wealth, and they say that was the reason for the plagues. Again, superstition, again, thinking about judgment, but they point at the Pope and said, he's the reason that we are having this great plague. Secondly, the reason that we're having the plague is because the Pope should be living in Italy, not in France. So there was two different reasons that they were thinking that why we have plagues. Well, we want to blame somebody. They're blaming the Jewish people. We're going to start blaming the Pope. Next, Innocent the Sixth planned to return to Rome, but his papacy was very short. He ends up dying before he can get to Rome. Pope Urban V, from 1362 to 1370, does return the papacy to Rome, but because there's mobs that are trying to kill him, the disorder of the community, he goes back to France. He's like, I'm not going to deal with that. Gregory the 11th is nephew to Clement the 6th, who was urged by Catherine of Siena to return to Rome. And in this person, Catherine, she's important because she ends up kind of smoothing things over for the Pope before he goes into Rome again. Catherine was a mystic Christian who was part of the Dominican order, so she was part of that scholarly order, who had visions. One of those visions was she actually married Jesus, so that's kind of heretical to a point. Like, Jesus was single and he was never married, but she had a vision that she married him, so that's kind of heretical. But in one of the visions that she had, it was to go to Rome and to help things get smoothed over so that the Pope can return. Catherine spent time healing, talking to the city leaders, telling them don't have war anymore with France, to calm things down, to do the things that God's calling them to do as Christians. And so in 1377, Gregory ends up entering Rome, and the papacy, we call it, returned from exile. They were in France for almost 70 years, and now they're back where they belong. He's the Bishop of Rome. Technically, he should be in Rome. Catherine is one of the two women in the Catholic Church who are known as the doctors of the church. Doctors, I'm not sure exactly how they phrase that in the Catholic Church, but she is one of two women, so there's not that many. Two women who are called doctors in the church. When it was because of nepotism, that is when you have a relative and you are constantly hiring relatives. Another term for that is called simony. Simon would hire his family in order to be pope, kind of a thing. That was the concept. There was corruption. The next pope, Urban VI, began to clean house with the corruption of the cardinals. Most of the cardinals were still French. And what he did was he said, you all are French bishops. Why aren't you in France, and why are you here? You're taking money from the church by not doing your job where you're supposed to be. And so he charged them with perjury. He stripped them of what they were called, cardinals, and he gave those to Italian cardinals. So the reform that Urban wanted was a reform of people being French in the court of the Pope to being more Italian. Because of this, Urban called for reformation, but he ended up hiring his family. He appointed family members to position of power and nationality. The papacy turns from French to Italian again. Nepotism, as we saw with Gregory the 11th being the nephew of Pope Clement VI, shows some of that simony. He appointed his nephew bishop, or part of the cardinal group, at age 17. So there's no experience, there's no anything. It's just, this is my nephew, he needs a job, I'm going to give him a job as a cardinal. And what ends up happening, a cardinal is over this area, and this area, and that area, so this group is paying him, this group is paying him, and this group is paying him. But guess where he's at? He's in Rome, not doing his job at these three places. So he's constantly getting paid, and that was the charge of perjury from Urban. But it's sadly, unfortunately, it was been happening then, and these cardinals were getting a lot of wealth because of these taxes that the church were doing. And they were being appointed to positions of authority. Being in the church was a good source of income for these people, and many of their families became wealthier because of it, as they would give their families money. What we find at this time is that all these things lead to the collapse of the medieval era because there's a desire to reform, and there's reforms that are not actually reforms. They're just political moves. They're not reforms. In a way, I think about this in today's political world. You hear a promise from a politician, and then you don't see anything happen. You wait for midterms. Are they keeping their promise? No. But they promised it, so maybe by the end of their, nope, it didn't happen. So you see this same thing happen today, right? My thought from when I read this is very much like what Machiavelli writes about. He writes about how the corruption, you can be corrupt. You have princes in Spain, you have princes in Germany, and you can be as corrupt as you want as long as you get away with it. And unfortunately, that became really the politics of this era. So what ends up happening? You end up with two popes again. Urban is still pope, but then people over in France say, we don't like that pope. We're going to have a conclave, and we elect a French pope. Clement the Seventh gets elected, and Christendom is told to take sides. If you're France, you have a lot of enemies. England, Spain, Germany, all these other groups join and say the true pope is the pope in Rome. Where you have in France and a few of their allies are saying, where's the pope? He's in France. We only voted for that pope in Rome because of coercion. There's no real pope in Rome. So then Clement in France makes war against Urban in Rome. Clement goes to Avignon, France, that special place of the Babylonian captivity of the church. England, Scandinavia, Germany, all those are supported by the Roman Pope. Parts of the Germanic kingdoms that are around Avignon then say we are part of supporting this Pope. So even Germany then starts coming apart. We have this area of Germany supporting, and then other princes of Germany not supporting. So there's two popes, there's more war. Unfortunately, you see what the collapse of this medieval era is, right? Corruption, nepotism, wars. Sadly, I talked about the two popes. Somewhere named Pisa, they end up declaring another pope. So now we have three popes. That pope is named the anti-pope John, the 22nd. It gets confusing because you have all these popes and they all have their names that they take on, of Urban, Clement, all these different names, and they have then the numbers behind them. What's really confusing is when you get a pope that's no longer technically a pope because they were a false pope, and so you have multiple John 22nds. That's when things get really confusing. Are you talking about the real Pope, John 22nd? Or are you talking about the anti-pope, John the 22nd? So because of this, a pope by the name of Alexander comes to power. This era is known as the Great Western Schism because of the conflict that's been happening between these three popes. And it lasts from 1378, the year after the Pope moves back to Rome. Conflict happens. But it ends in 1417, and here's why. Alexander's successor, John the 22nd, calls for a council to help solve this. And guess who's not invited? The Pope in France. So they have this council, this anti-pope and the Pope in Rome, and they have this meeting, and they declare that that Pope is excommunicated, so therefore he's no longer technically Pope because he was never really fully elected the right way. And so therefore, because of that, the real Pope is in Rome, and this guy who is the anti-Pope, he ends up resigning and saying, I shouldn't have been elected in the first place. So he probably got something corruptly in power because of this, but the Pope in Rome then ends up staying the Pope in Rome. After Gregory dies, Pope Martin V ends up becoming the one true Pope, and he stays in Rome. I didn't hear that the archives ever moved back, but I'm guessing they moved back sometime when Gregory moved back. But that was something that I thought about. When did those stuff move back? Like if Avignon and... So what ends up happening at this time? Papal authority continues to get questioned. It was universal authority by the time of the 1200s, and then by the 1250s and later, everybody's questioning the Pope. Does he have the authority that he says he has? Is he really the descendant in authority from Peter? They start questioning, they start thinking about that. Then we also see all the corruption in the church. And people start pushing back, saying, why is the church that is Jesus, why is this happening? Why is this something that we need to start thinking about doing something about? And you have the backings now of powerful figures in England in Germany, in Spain, and partly in France, because now they're hurt because they don't have the Pope anymore. And so you see in Germany, you'll see Luther. In England, you'll see Cromwell, and you'll see Thomas Cranmer and King Henry. In Spain, you'll start to see some of the reformers, but in Spain, it's much less. It becomes more Catholic. So in a way, the Catholic power in Scotland and in Spain during the time of the Reformation, that stuff really starts to show up more so with Queen Ferdinand and Isabella. At the end of next week, we'll hear more about the Catholics and their conquest to the west across that big pond called not Lake Michigan, the Atlantic Ocean. Sorry, my family, they live in England, so we call it the pond. They live across the pond. So all of this happening, calls for reform that were never fully answered. We begin to see roots that are taking place. We'll talk more about that next week. The roots of the Reformation. We'll talk about John Huss and the Lollards, and we'll talk about the Lombards, all these groups that began to start pushing back against the Pope. We'll also talk about another movement that was happening during the time, the Renaissance movement. So many people forget about the Renaissance was actually towards the end of this era. So you have the rise in the golden age of the church in the medieval era. You have the decline, but what goes down also comes back up. But it doesn't come up with Christianity, and because the Pope's authority is being challenged and Christianity in a way is being challenged, we see more of this thing called humanism. We'll talk more about that next week. And the last thing that we'll talk about next week is the age of discovery. What year did Columbus sail the ocean blue? 1492. That is part of our 1500 cutoff line. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the Columbus and his expansion going to the West Indies, which we know is not the West Indies. They're really the Caribbean islands. And so we'll talk about all that next week, about 15 minutes on each of those things so that we can try to keep everything in one sweet little basket because there's a lot to talk about next week. And I'll make sure that my printer has good paper because this paper did not print page 18. So there's a lot of drama on that. There's a pope, and then there was this other pope, and then there was conflict, and there was another pope, and there was conflict. It was interesting drama. So that's the presentation for tonight. Thank you so much, anybody who are joining online. I know some of you are joining online. And yeah, that's it. You're welcome.